There are crimes that arrive like a thunderclap and leave a single, clear ruin. And then there are crimes that unfold like a long, slow collapse, a man-made landslide that buries everything in its path. One lie stacked on another until the house of a family disappears entirely. And this is one of those collapses, a string of deaths that began in the dark of a backyard and ended with a man who thought he could bury both bodies in truth, only to be unmasked months later, arrested across state lines, and finally, years after the first loss, held to account in a courtroom where the families tried to name what was taken from them. Welcome to Dark Matters TV, where every crime we explore is more than just the violence that took place. It's about the lives forever changed by it. Today we step into the chilling and tragic story of Shelby Nealy, a man whose choices unraveled in ways no one could have imagined. Behind the headlines of murder and betrayal lies not just the crime itself, but the echoes of lives stolen, a family shattered, and the haunting question of how love and trust can twist into something unrecognizable. This was not the work of an unknown predator lurking in the shadows. It was something far more sinister, unfolding within the walls of home, among those who should have been safe. And the devastation that followed has left scars that will never fully heal. Here, we move slowly through the layers, the background, the choices, the breaking point, and the fallout that shook an entire community. Because behind every trial there is a family grieving, behind every headline there are names that deserve to be remembered, and behind every crime there is a life, or in this case lives, that truly mattered. If you're searching for more than just the facts, if you believe these stories deserve to be told with care and dignity, then you've come to the right place. We share them with empathy, with honesty, and with one promise, that the victims' voices will never be lost, and their light will never be forgotten. This is the story of Shelby Nealy, the man accused and later convicted in a string of killings that shattered a family in Florida. A story of a marriage that turned fatal, of messages sent in another person's name, of bodies buried and then exhumed by truth, and of the way small betrayals can become monstrous when they're given time and space to grow. The kind of case that forces us to ask how someone we thought we knew could become the person who erased lives. At the center of this story is Shelby Nealy, a young mother whose life ended far too soon, and her family, Richard and Laura Ivancic, and their son Nicholas. People rooted in a tight community, parents and siblings who answered one another's texts and showed up for holidays, who trusted the man their daughter had married. They did not know that behind the small kindnesses of everyday life, a plan was forming, the slow unspooling of deception that would take their daughter and then later their lives. Shelby Nealy's early life, like many true crime narratives, is a tangle of ordinary detail and private strain. Friends remembering him as someone who could seem both quiet and intense, someone whose relationships sometimes held turmoil beneath the surface, and who by 2018 was married to Jamie and the father of their children, a household that, from the outside, appeared like the slow, ordinary rhythm of daily life, a job, bills, and the small rituals of family dinners and diaper changes, but inside which a darker rhythm was forming, one that would end in the violence that we are about to tell. January 2018 began ordinary and then burst into horror, because in that month Shelby Nealy did not come home from what should have been a normal day, and by the time investigators sifted through the scene, evidence led them to a devastating conclusion. Jamie had been killed in the home she shared with Shelby. Her life ended in a manner the state would later describe as strangulation and blunt force violence. And then she was buried, not far from where she had lived. Shelby would later confess to that killing, admitting that an argument with Jamie turned lethal, and in the months that followed he would manipulate the shells of her online presence, sending texts and messages in her name to family members to delay suspicion and make her absence invisible. Those deceptions bought weeks and months. They bought distance between him and detection. That detail, that he impersonated her online, answering messages and sending photos to lull her family, reads like a plot device in a thriller, but it's real and terrible because grief is slowed, delayed, reshaped when someone you love appears to respond to your texts, even as their body lies elsewhere. And for a while, Jamie's family believed messages that said she was fine, that she was traveling, that she had problems with her phone, and only when those messages failed to fill the silence did suspicion begin to pry at the edges of Shelby's facade. By December of that same year, the horror widened, because the deaths did not stop with Jamie. Instead, Shelby traveled to the home of Jamie's parents in Tarpon Springs, and the violence escalated into another level of cruelty. The occupants of that home, Jamie's parents Richard and Laura, and her brother Nicholas, were bludgeoned to death in an attack that prosecutors say was calculated and brutal, and more chilling still. 3 family dogs were killed as well, all of it intended, according to investigators, to extinguish witnesses and to try and bury the last visible links to Jamie's disappearance. The bodies were left in the home and would only be discovered later, the discovery pulling the family's world into a grief so profound that words would never hold the edges of it. Police would trace Shelby's movements with messages, with surveillance, with testimony, seeing a man who had traveled back and forth, who had taken measures to conceal his crimes, who had returned to Ohio, where he had roots, and who was ultimately found and arrested in January 2019 while investigators were closing in, the net tightening around him because of photographs, because of texts, because of the tiny fingerprints of planning that show in even the most desperate deceptions. He was taken into custody in Ohio and eventually transported back to Florida, where the weight of 3 new deaths and the earlier loss of Jamie now rested upon him. In recorded interviews played later in court, Shelby spoke in the kind of halting clarity that can both shock and numb. He confessed to killing Jamie, to burying her in the backyard, to pretending to be her online, and he described returning to the Ivancic home and committing even more violence. Words that prosecutors played and that jurors listened to with the grim attention reserved for confessions, because admissions like that collapse the space between suspicion and truth, but confessions also raise the question of motive, and motive here is tangled. Shelby would say he was under strain, that he feared his children's safety, that the relationship had been volatile, and prosecutors would answer with a different logic. That the killing of his in-laws was premeditated, a step taken to erase witnesses after a first violent act, and that the pattern of deception and planning shows calculation, not mere panic. The courtroom, when the case returned to it, became a place where families spoke truth to a man who had taken their loved ones, where jurors saw both documentary evidence and the human cost, where the state laid out timelines and texts and photos that mapped Shelby's steps through the months of concealment, where victim impact testimony gave the dead back their names through memory, and where defense attorneys tried to argue that their client was broken. That trauma had a role, that his actions, however monstrous, were not the product of a man who planned coldly, but of someone who had snapped under pressure. The jury, faced with those competing realities, had to find which story best fit the evidence. The legal path in this case is long and technical, but to summarize the milestones clearly, Shelby pleaded guilty in separate proceedings, accepting a 30-year sentence in the earlier case after pleading to manslaughter with a weapon in connection with Jamie's death, a sentence reflecting plea bargaining and the evidence amassed about that killing, and in later years he pleaded guilty to additional counts tied to the deaths of Richard, Laura, and Nicholas Ivancic, plus aggravated animal cruelty. For killing the dogs in the Tarpon Springs home, rulings that carried the most serious exposure of all. The state later sought the death penalty for the 3 in-law murders, and in July 2025 a jury in Pinellas County recommended that Shelby be sentenced to death, a recommendation that reflects the jury's conclusion about the aggravating and premeditated nature of the crimes. Those outcomes were not instantaneous. They were the product of investigations that spanned years and courtroom fights over how to measure guilt, responsibility, and mercy. When prosecutors walked jurors through evidence, they relied on timelines derived from phone records and text messages, surveillance that placed Shelby at key locations, witness testimony showing his presence and sometimes odd behavior around the family, photographs he took that suggested planning, and forensic steps that linked him to both the concealment and the crimes. And when you assemble that mosaic, it begins to look less like a single tragic misstep and more like a sequence of choices that culminated in a planned effort to eliminate witnesses and then hide what had been done, an effort that ultimately failed because the living kept asking questions and the fragments of truth kept adding up. At this point, I hope you already clicked the subscription button. If you have not, go ahead and do so. It helps us to keep shading more light to stories like this. To speak of victims is to speak of ordinary days interrupted, of plans never fulfilled, of relationships cut short. And we return now to those people who were lost, not as statistics but as lives, because Jamie was a mother whose family scrambled to explain her absence, because Richard and Laura were parents who expected to grow old surrounded by children and grandchildren, because Nicholas was a brother whose absence left a hollow that no sentence will fill, and the narrative of Shelby's actions is also a narrative of the silence left behind, the birthdays that will be celebrated without those voices, the holidays missing the warmth of their presence, the small evidences of life that will never be recovered, and it is precisely the shape of that loss that jurors and later judges have to consider when deciding the weight of punishment. Defense attorneys sought to humanize Shelby in the penalty phase, presenting testimony about his childhood, reported mental health struggles, episodes of abuse he claimed to have witnessed or endured earlier in life, and pleas that the jury spare him from the death penalty because a life behind bars, they argued, would be punishment enough, and because his children, they said, might one day want to reclaim a father who had also done things wrong but was, in the end, capable of remorse. But the state countered with the magnitude of the harm done and the need to measure the aggravating factors that weigh heavily in capital cases, setting mercy against culpability in an ethical tension that juries are forced to resolve. After testimony, after argument, after the long work of assembling grief and fact into a single room, the jury returned with a recommendation that reflected the seriousness of the crimes. An 11-1 vote recommending the death penalty for all 3 counts tied to the deaths of Jamie's parents and brother. A recommendation that underscored their view of the premeditation and cruelty they heard about and reviewed in the evidence, and which would send the case into the final, somber stage of judicial decision-making, where a judge must decide whether to follow the jury or impose a different sentence. One of the more haunting strands in this case is how ordinary conceits of privacy and convenience allowed lies to survive for so long, because Shelby's ability to pose as Jamie online gave him space to hide what he had done, and because grief is often delayed by such illusions, but the same deceit that buys time also builds a trail of evidence. Texts that later raise questions, photos that conflict with explanations, oddities that prompt probes, and eventually, through the patient labor of detectives and the persistence of a family unwilling to let silence stand, the truth came out, a reminder that even deliberate concealment leaves traces, and that the smallest acts of curiosity, a child asking why a text didn't feel like their mother, a relative calling and not getting the answer they expected, can begin the undoing of the most carefully crafted falsehood. Sentences and verdicts do not measure grief, and even the most detailed legal outcome cannot deliver the daily presence of a lost son, daughter, parent, or sibling back into a household, but they can mark a social recognition that a wrong was done and that the person responsible has been held to account. And so the Ivancic family has to live with 2 conflicting processes at once: the slow, private work of remembering the shape of the people they lost, and the public, performative work of the courtroom that names the deeds and assigns punishment. Both necessary, neither sufficient to heal, both part of the strange, uneven architecture of justice. High-profile cases like this one invite commentary, speculation, and the kind of media attention that can sometimes feel like a second wound to families. And as reporters followed the case, airing bodycam footage, confession recordings, and courtroom testimony, the public learned details that were painful to hear and necessary to record. And the ethical question for storytellers and viewers alike is how to hold attention on the facts without turning loss into spectacle. How to say plainly what happened while keeping the deceased at the center of the narrative, and how to use the story to teach rather than simply titillate. If you're following this episode because you want to understand what happened and to remember the people who were taken, please consider subscribing to the channel, because every new subscriber helps us tell these stories with the depth and care they deserve. And if this case moved you, leave a comment to share what you think justice looks like in a world where harm and grief are so complex. What this case forces us to confront are uncomfortable truths about control and concealment in relationships, how the impulse to hide wrongdoing can multiply harm, and how social technology can be used as both camouflage and clue, and beyond that it asks a harder question. How do we build communities where cries for help are heard without excusing violence, where mental health struggles are addressed early without excusing lethal choices, where families are supported in the friction points of relationships so that small crises do not metastasize into tragedies? And those questions are not legal ones alone, but social ones that implicate neighbors, employers, schools, and the kinds of networks that can spot the signs before the collapse. Shelby Nealy sits now behind walls he cannot pass, a man whose crimes stripped away the futures of 4 people and the quiet, ordinary promise of days to come, and the court's work is to mark that as a moral and legal fact, to say that some actions require the gravest penalties, while families are left to gather the daily tools of living and to remember birthdays without the voices that once filled them. And if there is any solace to be found in the end of this story, it is the certainty that the truth, however delayed, did arrive, that the families who asked questions did not have their grief closed off by silence, and that the legal system, for all its limits, did what it could to answer who, how, and why. If this episode mattered to you, subscribe, ring the bell, and share it with someone who believes these stories should be told with care. And until next time, stay safe and stay aware.